can speed me up or slow me down however much you want. If I'm standing up here too long, just start clicking. So I forgot to tell Ryan in the announcements that I'm planning to travel. I have a flight on Thursday to Bogota, and I don't plan to return until the 28th of December, so I'll be gone for a while, Lord willing. And so because of that, I wanted to revisit the theme in my last lesson of the year. Again, planned. I mean, we have no idea. Something could change on Thursday and Colombia closes their borders and I just don't fly out right. But I'm saying all of this, Lord willing, right? Referring to James. I just wanted to revisit our theme. So this lesson actually would probably be more appropriate as like an introduction to, the theme. I'm sort of redigesting Ephesians 4, and then narrowing it down and redigesting a little bit of our theme passage in a different way, but by way of sort of reminder, right? For us to think about the things that we've approached and the things that we've attempted and the things that we've learned over the last year with respect to growing in our ministry and what that means. So it's going to be a little bit mechanical to start with. I ask you to just bear with me. Because I am just sort of breaking down the structure of Ephesians a little bit again. I'm going to refer to some ways we've thought about Ephesians in the past, and the way I still primarily think about Ephesians, but then I kind of want to change the way we think about the structure of Ephesians as well, for the purpose of applying our theme to us, not necessarily anew, but just sort of putting a bow on it for me. You guys have a few more Sundays together. But growing in unity, referring to not just growing in service, but referring back to the beginning of chapter 4. And you'll see what I mean as we go through this a little bit. So this is kind of how I think about Ephesians. And I really can't stop thinking about Ephesians this way. It's got this really easy structure. Sometimes I hate chapter breaks, but Ephesians chapter breaks are great. I don't think I would change any of the chapter breaks in Ephesians. And if it didn't have chapter breaks, I would put them in there. It just works out really well. So, in the first half, you've got this theology. Chapter 1 is the in him chapter. Chapter 2 is the death to life chapter. Chapter 3 is like the wisdom of God chapter in my head, right? I like verse 10 in chapter 3 because it says, when God wanted to show his wisdom to not just like the earth, when he wanted to show his wisdom to every created being, he pointed to the church. And he said, that's me. If you want to know my wisdom, look at the church. That's kind of awesome, right? But that's kind of the sense of the first 3 chapters. You've got this theology. And I don't mean that it's unapproachable or not understandable. I just mean it's not like, thou shalt, or stop doing this. There's really none of that in the first 3 chapters. You can apply it, obviously. But Paul is just trying to describe who God is and our relationship with him and what he's done for us, right? And we all understand that. And then the last 3 chapters are the practice, right? Therefore, do these things, right? Kind of the conclusion, the application portion of the sermon, we would say, right? Okay, that's great. We've got all these blessings in Jesus. Well, if I stop in chapter 1, that's all I know. And that's nice, right? But so we understand chapters 4 through 6 are kind of, what do we do with this information? What is our response to this information? And lots of people come up with responses, right? We see all kinds of people in the world trying to approach God on their own terms. But chapters 4 through 6 in Ephesians is Paul saying, hey, this is actually kind of what God expects you, how he expects you to respond. He doesn't just want you to respond in the way you feel or what you like, right? So this is nothing new, right? We understand all this. But for today, I want us to think about it slightly differently. They're not contradictory, but just a different way of phrasing it, really. In the first 3 chapters, I want us to think about it is, this is what is. Like, in him you've received all these heavenly spiritual blessings, right? Well, that's just a fact. That's what is. That's what, again, another way to say it, and I've already said it once, what God has done. Right? We can't undo what God has done. I can't go decide the church doesn't get the spiritual blessings in Christ. There's nothing I can do about that. I can't stop it. I can't improve it, right? Chapter 2, we were dead in our trespasses and sins, and God has made you alive, right? Well, I mean, I can change that about myself, but I can't change God making people alive. That's just what is. There are people that God has made alive who were dead. Right now, that's what is. And referring to the church, right? God's wisdom. I can't, go up into heaven and say, no. God's wisdom is really shown in the human body or the nature. I can't do that. I'm going to lose that argument because I'm arguing with God. You see, what is His wisdom is seen in the church. He decided that, and He says this is how I want my wisdom defined. So these are the things that are. And then 4 through 6 is what ought to be. Meaning that God has given us freedom. God has given us authority. Not on His level, obviously. But he restricts Himself and holds back and stands back and says, okay, here's what is, but here are some things that ought to be, and I want to see what you do with that. And I kind of like the word ought because it carries this idea of right and wrong. Like when I was a kid, ought was about right and wrong. But it also carries the idea of appropriateness, right? Well, if this is true, then this ought to be true. It has nothing to do with morality or right and wrong. It's just what's appropriate, what should be a natural outcome, right? So I'm going to kind of use this. I'm not really going to visit much back on the first 3 chapters. But I'm going to use this ought, right, to kind of bring us back to not just the right and wrong, but the appropriateness. Thinking about chapters 1 through 3, what's appropriate, right? So I want to visit our theme passage here again real quick, and I've highlighted the verses that we pulled our theme from, right? So if you notice, if I go back here real quick, you'll notice our theme passage came in chapter 4, so it's at the beginning of this ought section, right? What ought to be. And that makes sense because our theme is calling us to action. So I'm going to read this again. Ephesians 4, beginning in verse 11. He gave some as apostles, and some as prophets, and some as evangelists, and some as pastors and teachers, for the equipping of the saints for the work of service, to the building up of the body of Christ, until we all attain to the unity of the faith and the knowledge of the Son of God, to a mature man, to the measure of the stature which belongs to the fullness of Christ. As a result, we are no longer to be children, tossed here and there by waves, and carried about by every wind of doctrine, by the trickery of men, by craftiness and deceitful scheming. But, speaking the truth in love, we are to grow up in all aspects into Him who is the head, even Christ, from whom the whole body, being fitted and held together by what every joint supplies, according to the proper working of each individual part, causes the growth of the body for the building up of itself in love. So as I said, I highlighted kind of the phrases or whatever where you can see growth, right? Or you can see growing up or growing in ministry, right? But if you think about ought, right, you can see a lot of ought things in here, okay? So Jesus gave some of these gifts, right? What ought to happen is equipping, ought to happen. It doesn't say like God forced it, right? If it was a chapter 1 through 3 thing, it would just say God equipped. Well, that's kind of this, right? He gave. He did that. But there's an ought, right? Meaning, this might not happen. It might not happen. In individual cases. I mean, in the universal sense, it is happening. Like, God's word is accomplishing what it's intended. But on the individual level, it ought to happen. but it might not. And that's kind of all through this passage, right? To the building up of the body. Well, okay, yeah, in the universal sense, Christ's body is going to be built up, but this is something on a local level that ought to be happening. And we have to face the fact that, right, well, okay, it might not. And why might it not? Right? Till we all attain to the unity of the faith, that ought to happen. That's a future thing, right? It means that necessarily we haven't all attained to the unity of the faith. That's something that should happen. Okay, I'm not going to go through all the oughts in here, but I mean you can start to see when Paul is writing about the things that should be resulting from what God has done. There's all kinds of ought, and I don't mean like just right and wrong. I mean just appropriate. If God has done all these massive and these great kind of works, and he created the church, and he says, oh look, the church is my wisdom. Well, when you look at the church, what ought you to see? Just a mess? That's your wisdom? Ew. I don't want any of that. I mean, there are people who look at churches and that's their reaction. And I don't mean it's because they don't like righteousness. I mean, they just look at churches and they're just like, no. No. I'm going to go find my own brand or my own flavor of Christianity or whatever. And I mean, it's because they're responding to a really bad church. None of these oughts are actually happening anywhere. I'm talking about a local church, right? You can't look at the universal church and have that response. You know why, right? Because God is the one who maintains that universal church. It is perfect in every moment of time because the people who are in it are the people who are supposed to be in it. And the people who are not part of it shouldn't be part of it because God is maintaining that. But he's put this ought on us here, these local congregations, to say, okay, look at the universal church and try to do that locally. Try to do that here, right? That's the ought. But I want to point this out. We didn't start in verse 1 with our theme. We started in verse 11. So I want to back up. I want to look at Ephesians 4 a little bit broader because the whole chapter is really the beginning of this ought section, right? And so every time I say ought, I'm going to say it a lot. It's really going to annoy you guys. It's already annoying me. But every time I say it, what I want you to think about is, okay, what is the ought based on? It's based on these amazing things from the first 3 chapters. If I thought I had time, we would have just read the first 3 chapters. They're amazing, right? I mean, what God has done and the way Paul describes it is just, I love it, right? So when I say ought, right? Think 1 through 3 is the basis of that. What should flow from 1 through 3? Well, this is where he begins it, right? So let's back up to verses 1 through 6. Again, I'm not going to read this whole chapter because I don't have the time to. Well, I am going to read the first 6 verses, though, because these are really what the rest of the sermon is about. Ephesians 4, 1 through 6. Therefore, I, the prisoner of the Lord, right? Therefore, right? He's pointing back to everything that he said, right? Implore you to walk in a manner worthy of the calling with which you've been called. That's an ought. With all humility and gentleness, with patience, showing tolerance for one another, being diligent to preserve the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. There is one body and one Spirit, just as also you were called in one hope of your calling, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is over all and through all and in all. So what I'm going to suggest to you, at least for this lesson, for how we think about things this morning, is this is the foundational ought. All of these amazing things God has described, and Paul has described, and God has done in the first 3 chapters, right? The first thing Paul wants to say about that, when he gets done describing what is, the first thing he wants to say is, this is the expectation. Because of all that, this is the expectation. Unity. Right? So if God, right, I mentioned this earlier, if God says, you want to see how wise I am, look at the church, and you look over at the church and it's this fractured, just, mess, and it's like a Picasso or something. And you look at it and you're like, I don't get it. Well, Paul is here saying, this is the primary ought, is that you should walk in a manner that's worthy of that calling, right? Those first 3 chapters. You should walk worthy of those first 3 chapters. Well, I mean, first of all, that's really vague. Second of all, that sounds like, no way, I can't do that. I'm not worthy of those first 3 chapters. How am I supposed to walk worthy of those first 3 chapters, right? And that's what we're going to get to in just a second here. It's the only reasonable outcome. If a church is not in unity and is fractious and divided and divisive within itself, if that is not a reasonable outcome of those first 3 chapters, it means that what is at work in that church has nothing to do with God or Jesus or the Spirit. Right? And again, I'm speaking in terms, and at least in my head, I don't know if it's coming out this way. In my head, I'm speaking in terms of appropriateness. That's just the appropriate thing. It just makes sense. You just wouldn't expect something that God has put together to start falling apart on its own. It doesn't make sense. Right? So this is the foundational, this is the first ought, is unity. And then we get into the section where we had our theme that flows from this. 7 through 16 is what Jesus has done, right? Okay, so God didn't just step back and say, okay, I did all this wonderful stuff. Now you need to live up to it, right? No, it says he gave gifts, right? When he ascended into heaven, he gave gifts. He gave apostles, he gave prophets, he gave teachers. So this is what Jesus has done, and what he intended to accomplish, right, is growth. Meaning, right, implying you can't actually live up to it right now, but you grow into that. And actually, kind of the way it's written, just the fact that you're growing means you are fulfilling it. I'm sort of giving away I'm giving away the conclusion already, but that's because I can't help it. I mean, this is the expectation, but this is also expectation, right? Well, if you put those together, that means that if you're growing, you're achieving unity. Right? So I highlighted, right? This was our theme. And you can see how it plays into the ought, right? And then this is where I think the rest of the whole letter is really the same thing. I think from verse 17 on to the end of the book, here in this chapter, it's the beginning, right? He's beginning to describe the how. Okay, how? All of these things are vague. What do you mean preserve unity in the spirit of the bond of peace, or whatever Paul is, right? What does that mean? Why don't you tell me, to get 1 cup of flour and 2, cups of whatever. Give me something I can go do that I understand, instead of, well, that's what he does. I think that's what this is. This is the beginning where he says, okay, you want to know how to preserve unity? You want to know how to preserve peace? You want to know how to grow? You want to know how to grow up? I mean, there's another phrase in our, right? The measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ. Oh, well, okay, right. Like, who understands what that is? I don't understand what that is. I'm supposed to measure up to Christ somehow? I can't measure up to Christ. So there's a lot of vague things in here, and this is where he starts to say, okay, I'm actually going to tell you what that is. Like what you can go do to measure up to the stature of Christ. Because the way I've always thought about this chapter is, okay, there's this unity thing, and then there's this Christianity thing. Like, be a Christian, but be united with other Christians. Almost like they're kind of 2 separate things. Well, that doesn't seem like what he's describing here. He's describing one theme, which is this is what ought to be, right? And here's the foundation, and then here's kind of what it looks like, right? How you do it. So I'm going to give an example of that kind of structure, right? Not a biblical example, just an example, right? So there's this statement, the house ought to be sound. I mean, just like Scott can probably correct me when I'm wrong here. The building ought to be sound, right? You just start with that concept if you're going to build something. It ought to be sound. Well, the owner has delivered materials and blueprints that are sufficient to the task, right? That would be kind of like Jesus has given gifts, and he's done what is necessary for us to achieve the first two, right? Now you got to clear and grade the lot. You got to run utility pipes. You got to lay a foundation, right? Well, I mean, I didn't read any of these words up here. If I read the house ought to be sound, what does that tell me about the foundation? Well, if I don't know how to build a house, it doesn't tell me anything about the foundation. You see? So someone comes down here and says, okay, I'm going to tell you exactly what to do, right? If you don't grade the lot, the house is going to fall over. It's going to be crooked. It's going to shift. It's going to leak, right? If you don't clear it, you're going to put things under there that's going to make the foundation shift, right? You guys understand all of that stuff, right? I feel kind of like when Jesus was doing parables with agriculture, and everybody's standing around like, we know this stuff, right? I mean, I'm not really focused on building a house here, guys. And I'm focused more on the structure of Ephesians 4. So I think this is like verses 1 through 6. Unity, and you need to be worthy. Well, there's all kinds of details behind that aren't explained in those first 6 verses. Right? The owner has delivered materials, right? It's tied to this, but it's starting to talk about what the owner has done. Well, that's what Jesus did. He says, okay, I expect these things of you. And Jesus gave you materials and instructions, right? He gave you help, apostles, prophets, teachers. And he expects you to rely on those and use those so that you will grow. Well, again, you kind of don't know what grow means, like sufficient to the task. Okay, well, if I'm building a house and I don't know how to build a house, this still doesn't give me any details, right? Well, that's kind of verses 11 or 7 through 16, right? Still don't have any details. But when you get to verse 17, we start getting details. If you tell me to go clear a lot, I don't need any experience to go clear a lot. I can start dragging garbage off of a lot. I know how to do that. Right? So I think when we get to Ephesians 4:17, that's where Paul is starting to say, okay, this is what you need to go do now to achieve the unity, to achieve growth. Right? This is all, it's not rocket science, right? But this kind of helped me see Ephesians 4 and see Ephesians differently. That helped me not separate in my head, okay, achieve unity and be a Christian. Like go live your life as a Christian, and while you're at that, kind of make sure that you're achieving unity. I think Ephesians 4 actually kind of destroys that approach. So you see these things down here in this example, they all feed into this. What I'm suggesting to you is it's the same thing in Ephesians. And for me, this was, well, I think I've got it on the next slide. Yeah, fostering unity. So if we start in 17, what does it mean, right? Well, I mean, don't walk as the Gentiles walk. Well, okay, we wouldn't say Gentiles, but we would say eliminate this from my life, thinking and living like the world. Well, that's not high theology, right? That's not really vague stuff like, oh, you need to walk worthy. That's something you can go do. You look at the world and you say, oh, that doesn't look like God. I got to stop doing that, right? I mean, it's not rocket science. Ignorance, hard-heartedness. Eliminate these things. Eliminate the old self. That's a little vague, but as you learn more about the new self, which is what we're about to get to, you'll know how to do that. Eliminate bitterness, wrath, anger, clamor, slander, malice. I mean, those make sense, right? If you want unity, you can't have bitterness and all this kind of stuff. That sort of makes sense. But that's not where he stops. He doesn't just say eliminate these things. He says you need to cultivate things in your life as well. Right? Be renewed in the spirit of your mind. Put on the new self. That's a little vague. These two are a little vague. right? But I think the reason he adds stuff down here is, he's kind of explaining what those things are. Because I don't know what it means to put on the new self. I mean, just those words, right? I have to go look at the character of Jesus and say, oh, okay, he means I need to have compassion. Because my old self had no compassion, right? So I think Paul is kind of doing that. He says you need to speak the truth to one another. That's part of putting on the new self. You need to not let the sun go down on your anger. If you're angry, sort it out before the sun sets. Get rid of it. Deal with it. Right? The thief isn't laboring so that he doesn't need to steal. Did you notice that? I mean, that is one reason he's laboring, right? Let the thief steal no longer, right? But let him labor with his hands. But Paul doesn't say, so that he doesn't need to steal. It says, so that he has something to give. You see how that fixes two thieves' problems? He doesn't need to steal, and so he gives to someone who would be a thief. You see how that? So like a force multiplier, I don't know if that's the correct term. But one person, right, has this, or one principle with one person spreads out. So he gives to someone who's in need, and that person now doesn't have to be a thief. They don't even have to entertain the idea or be tempted by it. You see? Edify with what you say. Right? Now, I'm not going into details on all these because what I'm trying to really get us to think about is Ephesians 4, and really Ephesians from a higher level. And the fact that this is like that list of go clear the lot, grade the lot, right? Get the pipes laid. These are the details for the bigger picture. Well, Richard, it sounds like you're just saying be a Christian. I mean, I think that's exactly what Paul is saying. So I don't know if you guys have seen Despicable Me. I love that movie. The second one's the best one with Lucy. Anyway, when Gru has a good idea, right? He says, "Light bulb." I can't even do the accent right, but that's what he says. He stops and he's like, "Light bulb," right? That's kind of what happened to me back here on this. When I was going through this process, I was like, wait a minute. They're not two separate things. I mean, I literally was most of my Christian life pursuing two separate things. I'm like, okay, get your character right, and now deal with all these people who are Christians. I mean, because I don't like people. I don't like you. I mean, I just don't like people, like my personality. I like to be away from people. So for me, it was always like, get your character right, be like Jesus, and now figure out how to deal with all these people who are also Christians, right? You're supposed to be united with them. Well, Ephesians 4 kind of says that what's really happening is the more closely my life imitates Christ's life, the more unity I foster with and among my brethren. I think Ephesians 4:1 through the end of Ephesians is a long way of saying this. If you want unity in the church, look in the mirror and then look at the scripture. And wherever you see a gap, fix it. And that's engineering speaking like an engineer again, right? Gaps. We always talk about gaps at work. But for me, this was really relieving. I don't have to pursue two goals, like get my character right, and now like what does this unity thing look like? What does it mean, right? It doesn't mean like, oh, I've got to get rid of my lying, and then I've got to go make sure that Ryan and I agree on head coverings. It's not what it's talking about at all. What Paul is describing as unity is a group of people who are just doing this, whose lives are trying to more closely imitate Christ. We're not going, I was about to say we don't have to agree on everything. We're not going to agree on everything. Like if you find someone who agrees with you on everything, they're lying to you. They're trying to get something from you, right? Oh yeah, I think the same way. You know. Now, there will be things that we all do agree on, right? But unity is not just agreeing on everything. This is unity. So I think, like I said, for the rest of the book, he gives examples of this. All right, so I want to read the first 6 verses, first 6 or 7 verses. I took the numbers out of Ephesians 4, and then I want us to think about the examples that come later in the book. So Ephesians 4, verse 1. Therefore I, the prisoner of the Lord, implore you to walk in a manner worthy of the calling with which you have been called, with all humility and gentleness, with patience, showing tolerance for one another in love, being diligent to preserve the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. Okay, I'm going to stop there, because the rest of it is description. Okay, so then we think about husbands and wives. How do they play a role in unity in the church? Well, husbands and wives walk worthy of the manner, or walk in a manner worthy of the calling, with all humility and showing tolerance for one another in love. Wives, the way you show tolerance for your husbands affects the unity of the church. Husbands, the way you do or do not show tolerance for your wives affects the unity of the church. That's what Paul is saying. Now, I don't think he goes through and he gives concrete examples of every single relationship and every single thing that you're going to run into. I think what he's doing is he's touching on the really big ones, right? And he's forcing us to draw our own conclusions and say, oh, okay, really what he's saying is I need to examine all the relationships in my life and see if I'm really imitating Christ in those relationships. In the case of the wife, if I'm imitating the church, right, in the relationship to Christ. Right? Not the church local, the church universal. The intention, right? Parents and children, right? So, children, think about this. The way you show tolerance or approach your parents with humility and gentleness and patience, right? Yes, you need to show tolerance for your parents. That affects the rest of the church. It either fosters unity or it makes that unity more difficult. Your relationship with your parents and parents with your children. And then masters and slaves, right? He brings that in as well. I can see how that would be a major issue in the church at that time. Well, hey, we're brethren now, so you need to let me out of this financial obligation. You need to just forget this and it's not the way it works. You entered into a financial obligation if you're a slave. And so he says, you need to approach your masters, right? In a manner worthy of the calling of the first 3 chapters. Think about those first 3 chapters. As a slave, you need to be worthy of that. So, I say conclusion, but there's 3 points here. And again, for me, I hope this has been helpful for you, but this was really helpful for me in feeling like unity was something that could be achieved. Because it never felt like that was something that could be achieved. I always disagree with people. Well, it has nothing to do with agreement. We can actually be excited that we're in unity, not because we agree, but because every time we interact with each other, we understand, hey, you're actually trying to be like Christ as hard as I am. Like, I'm not grading you. I'm just excited about it. I see that, and I'm like, man, that's awesome. We're in unity, right? So growing in our service, right, if we go back to our theme, growing in our service to others is a path to unity with our brethren. It's not something separate. It's part of that plan that's laid out in Ephesians chapter 4. And that growth, it's not accomplished just by like, well, I'm going to sit here and hope it happens, and maybe it happens to me and it happens to some people faster. No. Specific, tangible ways as we emulate Christ. So every one of you have a different way, different next step that you need to take. So I can't stand up here and say, okay, this is what you need to do. But I will say this. Look for a gap between you and Christ in character, right? Look for a gap. Find a gap in your character compared to Christ's character. And if you go work on that, you are achieving unity with your brethren, and you're fostering unity with your brethren. For me, that's an exciting thing because, like, I can't stand having a goal with no idea how to get to that goal. That drives me insane in life and in work and every other thing. I stress about that because there's been an expectation set and I don't know how to meet it. Well, this expectation of unity, it is something we can meet. Just by the way we approach our Christian lives. And then finally, unity then, right? At the end of this, it's an unavoidable outcome. You can't escape it. If we're engaged in this as individuals and we're like, okay, I'm going to grab on to Christ and I'm going to put him on. Unity can't be avoided because that's how God designed his church to be. Allowing God to transform us into the image of his Son. So, sort of about our theme, but more, I wanted to kind of investigate how our theme fit into this bigger picture of Ephesians and specifically in chapter 4. I hope that was helpful for you guys because it was something that I've been struggling with, not just like during our theme, but like for years in my Christian life, right? This idea of unity and what it really means and how to go about getting it. Well, for me, this helped me feel a lot more comfortable with that. If you guys have any questions or anything about this or think I said something out of line with Scripture, let me know. We're going to have another song, and then we'll have some closing announcements. Thanks, guys.